Thank you. It's lovely to be here tonight with you and get a chance to talk about this research. I'm a historian of Latin America, and I've been at the university for 4 years, and one of the things I've enjoyed about coming here is starting to learn about the connections between Aberdeen and the Americas. And as soon as I came, I started looking in the library catalog, looking in special collections. I introduced myself to Neil and said, what do you have in the museum collection? And I basically started nosing around, just seeing what would appear. And it was searching through special collections, looking literally country by country to see what kind of material we had. I searched under Brazil, and up came James Trail. Work in the museum store is how I came to know the collection and life of John McPherson, because although we don't have as much documentation on him, what we do have is a huge collection of objects. And tonight I'm going to take you in chronological order, starting with Trail and then looking at McPherson. And before we go on to talk about Trail himself, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about the Amazon in the 1870s, which is the period when he was exploring it. And then I'll give you some background on Trail and a bit about his time in the Amazon, the collections, and what came next. And then we'll move to Mexico. Now, as two academics, Felix Driver and Luciana Martins, argue, the tropics have long been the site for European fantasies of self-realization, projects of cultural imperialism, or the politics of human and environmental salvage. Now, the monumental Amazon River network has featured in these dreams of tropical landscapes for hundreds of years. For 19th century naturalists dreaming from afar, the sea-like expanses of the Amazon River, sweeping by densely forested banks, offered an alluring landscape for scientific work. This vast river drains more than half of South America. It contains 20% of the world's river water and has tributaries which run for over 1,000 miles. One of the tributaries runs for more than 3,000 miles. And in the 19th century, its scale, its climate, its flora and fauna all proved enticing to foreign naturalists. Moreover, by the second half of the 19th century, the Amazon River Basin was the object of what the historian Susanna Hecht has called the scramble for the Amazon. And if that sounds familiar from the scramble for Africa, she's deliberately echoing that description. She argues that by the mid-19th century, Brazil's vast Amazonian territories were maintained by thwarting the imperial ambitions of France, Britain, the United States, Belgium, Bolivia, and Peru. For example, U.S. Southerners schemed to colonize the Amazon, making it a new Liberia, and after the Civil War in the United States, the U.S. government actually sought to bring these ideas to life. Scientific and commercial field expeditions, like the one that Trail was a part of, by foreigners, were part of this challenge to territorial claims. And the information they gathered helped fuel imperialist plans. The territorial scramble and scramble for commercial gain and economic botany resources, that is, plants that had good economic potential, occurred as well in a period in which technological innovation was really shifting things in the Amazon in terms of travel and communication. Steamboats sailed along the river networks from 1853, while railroads and improved postal communications diminished geographic hurdles. Improved technologies for natural history collecting, especially for botanists, also made a real difference in the transportation of tropical plants. Wardian cases like this one kept plants alive during long voyages, and hothouses allowed them to survive in cold climates, creating a means to move and grow these plants outside the tropics, allowing for new markets to emerge. Now, into this context stepped James Trail, born on Orkney and student of the University of Aberdeen. We're lucky in the manuscript material that Trail has left behind and which is in special collections. It includes a manuscript short autobiography in which he describes his youth and his time as a student at the University of Aberdeen before he went to the Amazon. Now, as a student at the university, he recounted that during his spare time, he organized the University Museum, working with his natural history professor, James Nichol. This work gave him, he remembered, I'm quoting, "a practical acquaintance with systematic zoology, such as proved of great value to me. For 3 or 4 years, I was practically in charge of the zoological part of the museum. It was a labor of love, and I would not accept pay for it." And of particular importance to the young man were not just the formal and informal training he was getting at Aberdeen, but it was the care and affection that his teachers showed to him. He talked about Professor Nichol's constant kindness and encouragement, showing me that he thought my work was worth doing. Another influence was his botany professor, George Dickey. And Trail came from a difficult family background. His father was very strict, and the faith of these older men, these mentors, was really important to him. His father did not approve of his interest in the natural sciences. And Trail wrote in his autobiography, "I had hoped that my results in the natural science group for MA would show my father that I was not idling or using that side of study as an excuse to shirk what he regarded as more worth effort, and that he would withdraw his opposition to my desire to go on to scientific study. But his opposition was keen to my wasting time on what, he said, would never help me to earn my salt, much less my livelihood. He assured me it would only lead to starvation. Looked on me as a fool when I said I was willing to starve, if need be, for the sake of the work I thought myself fit to do." But Trail, at the same time as defying what his father wanted him to do, he was dreaming, and again I'm quoting from his autobiography, "If I could find work as a naturalist abroad, I had no expectation of any of the better posts at home, if possible in exploration. The Amazon Valley, from my boyhood, had taken a strong hold on my imagination, and I read every book about South America that I could procure from the university library and elsewhere." Now, despite hating the sight of wounds, and that's what he said, Trail decided to train as a medical doctor because "I recognized that there would be no more useful knowledge to a traveler, none stronger as a recommendation for a post as I desired." And his chance came when these two professors I mentioned, Nichol and Dickey, strongly recommended him for a field research post, despite the fact that he hadn't finished his degree at this stage. He was still a student. And thanks to their recommendation, he spent 18 months on the Amazon, surveying the Amazon basin for the British-owned Amazon Steam Navigation Company. It was the first foreign commercial interest authorized to explore the region. And this guidebook, which I'm showing you here, comes from 1904, was put out by the Amazon Steam Navigation Company. The Amazon, uniquely for that time, had ports open to international shipping, which had been open since 1867. And it was the biggest destination of British foreign investment in Latin America. And the Amazon Steam Navigation Company purchased a Brazilian company and then started expanding their networks and also surveying the lands, because the company didn't just have access to the waterways, it owned lands as well. And they were particularly interested in knowing if there were any plants with economic potential within the territory they owned. Now, so Trail was hired to basically look at the trees and look at the plants and see what was economically valuable, if anything. Nonetheless, he also had time for other types of natural history collecting, and he sent his specimens back to the UK with the help of the company's agent. So he was supported by the company in the broader natural history work that he did. Leading Trail's survey was a Canadian, Charles Barrington Brown, and William Lidstone. Barrington Brown had previous experience in the tropics, working in British Guiana, so he became the leader. The field researchers traveled with an interpreter, initially Pedro Vasconcelos, who hated being in the Amazon, called grasshoppers horrible jump devils and was more laughed at than with by the others on the expedition. They also were accompanied by William Abrams, who Trail described as a faithful Indian servant. Eventually, Vasconcelos, after a lot of grumpiness and writing letters back to base, please can you get me out of this horrible situation I'm in, he was replaced by James Cunningham, who was from Jamaica and half Scottish and educated in Scotland, but he fit in better. He got on better and he wasn't scared of grasshoppers. So in total, this group of 5 men with other people who they met along the way, sometimes who went with them, sometimes who they stayed with for periods of time, traveled almost 15,000 miles on the Amazon River system between October 1873 and March 1875. And this map gives you a sense, you can see the red, where they went. Now, despite the extent of the journey, it's worth noting that these were not, it wasn't exploration into the unknown, and in fact, Trail had with him publications from previous Amazon travelers, and he would often say things like, I was on Henry Walter Bates's favorite path today, or I met somebody who knew the Agassiz expedition. So these travelers very much followed the same routes. They often got their wood from the same stations. They hired the same guides. They ran into people who said, oh, I remember so-and-so, how's he doing? Well, give him my regards when you see him in England. So they were traveling in areas that were new to them, but not unexplored. Now, in this period of 17 months, Trail wrote about 700 pages of unpublished journal, which are in special collections, and it's a narrative of his travels. He sent these pages home in segments to his mother, and some of it surely made her heart skip a beat when she was reading about it. He also left, and this the image I'm showing you here, another notebook listing the material he donated to the zoological collection and the circumstances in which he acquired it. And you can compare the journal with this, and it gives interesting stories about how he acquired different natural history specimens. In terms of those specimens, he collected about 2,000 different species of plants, about 500 species of arthropoda, which hadn't been previously cataloged, as well as vertebrates and some ethnographic materials. He's also left for us, and this is in the exhibition, a palm notebook, and this was only found thanks to the diligent work of Malia, I think, in the herbarium. For this exhibition, we have an exhibition. We were looking for trail material, and she found this field notebook of palms. And it's the only field notebook that we know of which has survived. Now, for a historian, the best adjectives are new, undiscovered, and little researched. So this is absolutely brilliant, because I've only found one other person who's been interested in trail at all. That was a Brazilian student who wrote her PhD on him in the 90s, and it was never published and nothing more has been done. So he's really overlooked in the annals of Amazonian exploration. These are some of the specimens also that we found in the course of the exhibition research. This researcher I mentioned who did her doctorate on trail, she said that there really wasn't anything left in the zoology collection from trail, but we proved her wrong, finding this wonderful mata-mata turtle, and then also we found some material in the herbarium collection. And the howler monkey skull. All of these objects are in the exhibition. Now, the Commission was able to cover so many miles thanks in large part to the improvements of their means of transportation. Initially, they were confined to land. They'd go out on small boats for short expeditions, but they were basically camping or renting houses along the shores of the river. But then the company rented them their own steamboat, this small steamboat, the Beija Flor, which was a huge improvement, but still was fairly cramped for all the people involved in the expedition. And Trail has a drawing in one of the journal entries where he shows how the hammocks crisscrossed at night because they slept on the open deck, and they had an arrangement of whose hammock went over whom to make sure everybody was comfortable. So this is their improved transportation, but it got more luxurious after that. This is the Guajira, which is the steamboat they had at the end of their period in the Amazon. And you can see them on the desk there enjoying the shade, enjoying the breeze, and with their pet monkeys playing around. On this steamer, Trail finally had his own cabin, and it allowed him to be a little bit more comfortable as he was preparing his specimens for shipping back to the UK. This is a teasing illustration that his colleague William Lidstone drew of him and which Trail put in his journal pages, and there are a few like these. And they give a nice impression of the banter and the camaraderie amongst the crew on this expedition. Now, during all of these eras, the travelers were frequently accompanied for some periods, long or short, by people they met along the way. Some of these people, they saw a boat going the way they were going. They just, can I hitch a ride? Sure, on you go. And then they would, the crew would pump them for information about the area. Some were really just curious about the means of transportation. People would come up in their canoes, tie their canoes to the side of the steamboat, have a ride, and then go away when they'd had enough. They were just along for the ride. And they also ran into people with scientific interests like theirs. One was João Barbosa Rodrigues, who had been contracted by the Brazilian government to continue the work of early explorers in understanding the economic botany potential of the Amazon's palms. And he joined their expedition for a little while when they were on the cramped boat at the invitation of the interpreter, Cunningham. And everybody was really grumpy at Cunningham. They invited this extra body onto the boat when they were already struggling to hang their hammocks properly. And the images I'm showing you now, they come from the publication that came out of the expedition that Barrington Brown and Lidstone put together themselves. And it's also interesting to not triangulate, but compare the accounts in Trail's journal with the accounts in this published volume, because they give another person's perspective on what was going on. And certainly when it came to sharing palm hunting with Barbosa Rodrigues, Trail was not too keen on having the competition. Trail also received help from people they met along the way, and local informants were absolutely vital to getting the information they needed. Basically, without local people to tell them what they were seeing, they did not know what they were seeing. Local people to explain to them the uses of the plants, when things flowered, how to harvest, how to turn the harvest into something usable for people. All of that was very important, and they met with a lot of cooperation and support from people along the way. And the crew of the two boats also became field workers and assistants. Trail talks about, for instance, with the help of one crew member, I began to skin the alligator that they caught, and he found it a very tough job. After an hour or two of close work, we had removed the body and part of the tail, then put the skin in steep to soften up till tomorrow. And there was also an interesting overlap between practical hunting and hunting for natural history. So he recounted how the crew of the Guajira fished both for supper for everyone and for science for him. So on one of the rivers he reported, "Our men as usual landed in the evening to fish. About 12 o'clock returned. All our crew wore shirts and trousers when they went ashore, but on their return none wore both, and some wore neither. The missing garments were handed on deck filled with turtle eggs. that made a large heap when poured out of the shirts and trousers on the deck. Amongst the fish caught, some were new to me. That "some were new to me" is the beginning of a cataloging process and a naming process. Now, of course, there was nothing unusual in Trail and his expeditions' reliance on local knowledge and cooperation and working with local scientific figures. As Susanna Hecht points out, in Amazonia, an array of homegrown scientists, surveyors, and chroniclers, as well as armies of local inhabitants, supplied the local knowledge of rivercraft and the access, logistics, and information upon which the successful outcomes of expeditions rested. All European travelers depended on an invisible set of native intellectuals who made it possible for them to travel in these zones. They arranged for the labor that would haul these explorers in their gear. They were the scouts and the knowledgeable woodsmen who would do the hunting, navigate the treacherous waters, explain the landscape, and carry out most of the collecting. And part of the reason that this help in the field was so important was because field work doesn't have the simplicity of understanding specimens through museum study or academic study. Elizabeth Higgins Galfelter is herself a field scientist, and she's done some interesting oral histories with field scientists in the 20th century. And she talks about how in the field, one is faced with the confusing complexity of nature in its entirety. The lecture or textbook version of a natural phenomenon has undergone a scientist's interpretation and simplification. And we could also think about the museum versions as well, and especially thinking about the way Trail's education in zoology came through the museum specimens that he carefully arranged. It's a social product of interactions among individuals through both space and time. It's the scientist's approximation of some truth in nature. Now, Trail's journal offers, here's another Lidstone illustration of Trail. Trail's journal entries offer further glimpses of his practices and his own labor. He used an insect net to sweep for flying insects, shook leaves into his net, and searched for insects and frogs on stumps and under bark. While in the field, he kept his living creatures in a box until he could kill and preserve them. At night, and this is what we're seeing here, he used a light to attract and catch insects. And he observed that 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. is the most successful time in Amazonia with light. Hardly anything comes later. They all went to bed. So we've got then the spirit of the moth up here at the top, and Lidstone saying, "Poor race of moths," said the flying spirit, "deadly ye pay for your evening ball. Some moments of flutter ye shall inherit, but Trail and his bottle are after you all." Insects also offered themselves up quite unintentionally to become part of the collection, like the biting insects which fixed onto Trail's trousers as he went through the woods, making for easy catching and bottling. Now, bottled specimens were preserved in cachaça, which is a local sugarcane alcohol, and everybody they met was absolutely perplexed that they would waste perfectly good alcohol by putting ants in the bottles or things like that. But preserving specimens in this environment was quite a challenge because of the humidity, so things would mold a lot, and Trail would sometimes solder the specimens into a tin box and use carbolic acid for preservation. And local people, once they realized what he was interested in, they would bring him objects of interest as well, some of which he couldn't take home because they were just too big. So there were size restrictions on what he could manage. There were other skills to be learned in the field as well. Trail learned to swim in his clothing as practice for emergencies, falling out of the boat. And he also studied his Portuguese grammar. The practice of swimming in his clothing came good because one night he fell into the river while trying to rinse mud off of some plants he'd collected. Luckily for Trail, his absence was noted fairly quickly, and the Beija-Flor's canoe was sent out to retrieve him. He said, "When it reached me, my breath was about gone, as I'd learned to swim a little only since coming to Brazil, and of course had on my clothes, and thick shoes when I fell in. I found my adventure had caused a great sensation on board. But he said, the only bad consequence was that a bottle containing spiders, etc., collected during the past week had fallen from a pocket into the river. But when he got to the next town, everybody was still talking about the fact that he nearly drowned. So he downplayed it, but it really was quite a serious incident. And had they not noticed him gone, he would have died for sure. So one of the things I hope you're starting to get a sense of is how sociable Amazonian exploration was on the boats and also in terms of the people the expedition met as they sailed through this landscape. And that sociability was part of the networks crisscrossing the Amazon, and all sorts of circuits of power and relationship and politics were at work. And the expedition came across these as they traveled. For instance, people couldn't figure out what to make of them. Who are these people and what are they up to? And there was often skepticism about what they were up to. So in one instance where they anchored, the local people said that they'd heard that the Emperor of Brazil had sold all the inhabitants of the Amazon Valley to the English, and that we had arrived in our launch in connection with this matter, probably to count the heads of those who had been thus transferred. It was only one of the wild conjectures started to account for our mysterious proceedings. Perhaps the most favorite idea was that we had to do with the sale and repair of sewing machines. And regularly they also encountered people who were like, yeah, that's all fine, you're interested in bugs, but I've got a sewing machine, could you help me with that? The expedition, they were also asked if they were immigration agents. They were mistaken for press gangs at points, and then people would flee from them, or people after runaway slaves. And these networks also brought British products into the Amazon. When Trail arrived in Brazil, before they went inland, he said that you could find Aberdeen biscuits for sale, and he'd seen tins decorated with Balmoral Castle. And later, when the expedition anchored at the town of Faro, further inland, the men, and this comes from Barrington Brown and Lidstone's account, the men saw a decent-looking store, and they wondered if there was any English beer that they could get. But they didn't have high hopes because they were so far from civilization. And they walked in, and they found it. And they said, Bass Pale Ale, Peak and Freen's, or Huntley and Palmer's biscuits and commodities of that kind are your true travelers, continually turning up on the very confines of civilization to surprise the adventurous wanderer at the very moment, perhaps when he's congratulating himself that he's got far beyond the limits of manufactured articles of this sort. Should the North Pole ever be discovered, it would scarcely surprise us to hear that a bottle of ale, a tin of biscuits, or a packet of corn flour had been there to confront the successful explorers. And these products, the fact that they were circulating in the Amazon, was partially in response to the population boom of the Amazon in the 1870s. There was a drought in northeastern Brazil which pushed people into the Amazon looking for work, and the rubber boom was about to take off. So again, the Amazon exploration, it's kind of like, I don't know, exploring any kind of major immigration hub. You're there as an explorer and all these people are flooding there looking for work. And that's the situation these were in. These kind of networks, however, were largely invisible in Trail's journals. But what comes through much more in Trail's journals are the trails, pardon my pun, of previous explorers. So I mentioned, I've already mentioned to you Henry Bates, Louis Agassiz, but there was also Alfred Russel Wallace and Richard Spruce. And their social networks and their scientific networks left behind were what Trail was more interested in. And one of the things that's interesting about Trail's journals, they're much less circumspect than a lot of travelers' accounts. He's much more open about bodily function. You know, he tells you when he's having tummy troubles and diarrhea. But also he speculates and hears rumors and reports them that Bates had several children in the Amazon. And this is one of those things that I have never seen in an explorer's account. But it comes, you know, in various points. Someone says, no, Bates didn't have any children. And someone says, oh, yes, he's got two and one lives over there. So these rumors and counter rumors were circulating around the area. And he was faithfully recording them and sending them back to his mother. Now, news from home was, of course, very welcome, and they did have, through these kinds of networks I've been discussing, they did get letters and newspapers. Trail even got relatively speaking, current issues of Nature delivered to him. But the men really counted on each other for camaraderie and keeping their spirits up, sharing stories and experiences of success and scrapes and disasters. And what comes through in Trail's journals and also in Lidstone and Barrington Brown's publication is that sense of camaraderie and fun and laughing at adversity as a way of coping. And they were having a good time a lot of the time. And here's another, this is a Barrington Brown illustration, but another teasing illustration which has ended up in Trail's journal, of taking his usual. That's Trail taking his usual. You can see him with the mosquito net on his head. That's not to say, of course, that there weren't conflicts, and there were definitely fights, and he records them faithfully in his journal and takes sides, and a lot of it seemed to be around hierarchy and status and who was the boss of whom. I'm not your servant, for instance, being said regularly to the leaders of the expedition by some of their employees. Now, Trail also, he was traveling through an area that, because of this immigration, not just from within Brazil, but from out with Brazil, was one of the most multicultural, diverse places on the planet at this time. And Trail was very curious about the region's different ethnic groups, but he did approach Brazilians of all ethnicities, assuming the superiority of Europeans. He also seemed undisturbed about traveling in a country in which slavery was still legal, and he didn't seem disturbed by the fact that he and his colleagues were benefiting from enslaved labor at times. And his responses, he does mention enslaved people, and it's very anecdotal, just talking about individuals and kind of the curiousness of the situation. For instance, when an enslaved man asked the survey to buy him, Trail thought that was a curious incident. It didn't bring any musings about the legal situation this man was in. Trail, of course, met many indigenous people as well, and one of the terrific finds we've had in this exhibition, and this is thanks to looking at the documents of previous travelers compared with Trail's, is we actually have a name for this man from whom Trail bought the bow, which is on display in the exhibition. And his name was Torquato, and he was of the Wujugu people. And this illustration of him comes from Louis Agassiz's publication on Brazil. But you can probably see there, he's just labeled as a type, you know, a representative of a group of people, almost a representative of a species, rather than an individual. But because when Trail met him, he said, oh, you're the one who was in Agassiz's book. And Torquato said, yes, yes, I was, and my wife as well. And so we actually have a name and a little bit of background information. Frustratingly, Trail didn't mention the name of his wife, who's also illustrated in Agassiz's book. But by the time Trail met Torquato, she had recently died. So when he met Torquato, he was in mourning. But this is a really, it's a wonderful find to actually have the name and a little bit of information about the individual indigenous person who sold this object to Trail, which is now in the museum and in the museum collection. Now, Trail's attitude towards local people shifted over time, and he got more comfortable with Portuguese, with Brazilians, and he did get a little more nuanced in his views. The other group of encounters that are worth mentioning are with animals, because the different boats were absolutely populated with basically pets, but sometimes pets slash specimens depending on what's going on in the period of time we've got them for. And so Trail talks about when one of the ship dog's bodies, that's actually what some of them are called, had gone ashore looking for food. He returned, and not only did he bring very stale bread, but he brought a monkey, a lively, tame cebus, about half the size of a cat. And this is Trail. It has a smoothish, purplish face and a villainous expression, but is very good-tempered, and dances about as if on springs. It had little fleas in its paws, which brought on board, but they were at once extracted. It rejoices in the name of Felipe, now contracted to Phil. And there's lots of discussions about Phil and various other the monkeys on board and who they get along with, and do they have companions? And this kind of, I think it's part of surviving in what feels a hostile, alien place. It's part of making home, having these pets on board. But it's not just tame animals. There was also, for instance, when Trail, and I'm pretty sure that is Trail in the illustration, when Trail was in the saloon of the Guajara, he noticed a spider coming out from behind the clock, which you can see in the middle of that room there. And he started trying to train the spider and tempt it out with other insects for it to eat. And eventually, the spider appeared to trust him, and this is over a period of weeks, and he keeps reporting, what's going on with the spider. The spider would come out and take food from the tip of a pen and then disappear. And after a few weeks, he witnessed the spider molt. So that was it shed its skin. That was his reward for all that patience. And of course, we've talked already about the mata-mata, which lived, that devilish-looking turtle, which lived on the boat for about 3 weeks before it was killed and sent back to Aberdeen to reside now in our exhibition. So some of these animals were kind of in process, pets for a period, but then turning into specimens. Now, Trail's career after returning from the Amazon developed entirely in Aberdeen, and it was a very good career. Shortly after returning at the age of 26, he was appointed to the post of Professor of Botany, and it was a post he held until he died. He was well known in botanical circles for his research on Amazonian palms and also on much more local flora. And he's buried in St. Macher's churchyard just along the north wall. One of the things I find interesting about Trail is after these 18 months in the Amazon, his life was pretty well confined to the northeast, but that period in the Amazon set him up to come back and become established and successful in Aberdeen. So it was very important in his career. First he had to graduate, and then he could become Professor of Botany. All right, we'll move now, heading north to Mexico, which is where McPherson spent most of his adult life. And while Trail left behind a great deal of textual material and fewer objects in the collection, McPherson's the other way around. Lots of objects, not so much text. So it's harder to get a hold on him, of him. But one of the things that's interesting, I think, about considering the collection is looking at the objects with the documents that accompanied them. And we have a good range of those in what McPherson donated to the collection. Now, as I mentioned, I came across him as a figure because of my time working in the museum store, looking at the collections of objects. And while Trail is particularly tied to the zoology collection and the herbarium, McPherson is much more tied to archaeology and anthropology. And his ties were to the Anthropology Museum, which was founded at Marshall College in 1907 by Robert Reed, who was professor of anatomy from at the university from 1889 to 1925. And in this new anthropology museum, Reed brought together various collections, ethnographic, archaeological, and human remains. And this collection was very much a teaching tool, helping to train students who were going to be going out and working in empire in that period. And so the objects in the collection were to help them understand the cultures they were going to go live amongst and work with. Now, McPherson was a student in this period. He was born in 1872 in Mariecoulter and received his medical degree from Aberdeen in 1899, having studied with Reed. We don't know what he studied before he registered as a medical student when he was 22, but like many of his fellow medical students and students of Aberdeen at that time in general, he left Great Britain to practice. And he worked as a medical doctor in Mexico from the early 20th century until his death, 1941, I think. I don't have that in front of me. I'm pretty sure it was 41. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that he was in Mexico in this period of great change in Mexico, and it all seemed to kind of go by him. He wasn't interested in the slightest. Now, I've been doing my best to trace his life in Mexico. There's not a great deal of material that I've found to date, but thanks to help from colleagues in special collections who suggested looking at the British Medical Journal, I found several articles that he published while he was in Mexico. So our first indication of him moving to Mexico was 1903 when he published an article in the British Medical Journal. And there are various articles in the BMJ about patients he treated and the situation. And they put him on the coast of Oaxaca, on the Pacific, southern Pacific coast of Mexico, working at the port, at the Salina Cruz Port Works. When he arrived in Mexico exactly isn't clear, but as I say, he stayed on in Mexico, and Mexico was a place that was very proud of its ruins too. So he arrived to a country that had a long history of interest in its own archaeological record, and not just from the colonial period and in the 19th century when Mexico became independent, but even different indigenous cultures were interested in the cultures that came before. So there's a lot of kind of layers of history and interest in ruins like these. This, by the way, is Monte Alban in Oaxaca, and there were big discoveries there when McPherson was in Mexico, and he was quite curious about them, so I thought that was a good background for him. He also arrived, there's Aberdeen, in case you didn't know. But I like this sense of, you know, the Aberdeen he left, that being a bustling seaside resort, lots of optimism. The King and Queen were around for the 400th anniversary of Marshall College, the University of Aberdeen, all of that. But that's who I'm looking for. McPherson arrived in Mexico probably around 1903, and about 7 years after he arrived, the Mexican Revolution kicked off and lasted for approximately a decade. After the revolution, when the victorious factions started to reconstruct Mexico, everybody and their mother headed to Mexico. If you were a lefty and wanted to do things differently, Mexico was the place to be. It had muralists, and it had Tina Modotti, and it had Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and all these people. And McPherson's like this. I mean, it's like being in Russia during the Russian Revolution and not being interested. It's just amazing to me. Anyway, so we've got a bit of documentation talking about his time in Mexico, and we know he didn't leave. I mean, a lot of foreigners left. A lot of people would have left. The country was at war, but he stayed in Mexico, and we have a letter that he wrote to the university registrar about the U.S. intervention. The U.S. got involved in the Mexican Revolution at various points, and they invaded the Gulf of Mexico port of Veracruz. So he was talking about this period in 1914. He was living in Salina Cruz on the other side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and he says, I was then living in Salina Cruz when the smoke cleared after the U.S. invasion. The only two foreigners remaining there were John McNabb and John McPherson with their respective wives. The nationality of these two individuals is hardly in doubt. I recount the above incident probably somewhere in the spirit of the individual who proposed the famous toast, and you're going to have to forgive me as I say this. Here's to us, there's what's like us, name. So apologies for that mangling. But he was there with his wife during the Mexican Revolution. Fighting's going on, the U.S. is invading, there's troop movement all over the country, and he's just there. His wife was there at that point as well, Georgina Patton McPherson, but eventually they moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's not clear when she went. He went around 1925, and then she stayed. He was in Halifax probably about 5 years, and then returned to Mexico in 1930, and she stayed on. So they lived separately the last decade or so of his life. We also know he was in Mexico because of this object, which is in the exhibition. This is a mirror, which he has helpfully labeled that he got it in 1916, again in the midst of revolution, and he presented it to the museum in 1921. So all of these things help place him in Mexico. But why remains, well, as I say, it just seems odd that there's so little connection with the place coming through in the documents. It might be what I've managed to find so far. I might be unfair to him, but it does seem like you would write to someone and say, hey, there's a revolution going on. Did you not know? He moved to Halifax, as I say, around 1925, having had what he described as a complete breakdown in health. But about 5 years later, and then he had some difficulty finding another job, and he wrote to Reed, the head of the museum, about that, his difficulties finding another job. But in early 1930, he was hired by El Águila, which was a then British-owned oil company in Mexico, and he was hired as one of their doctors for their oil drilling camps on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, so the other side from where he'd been in Oaxaca, in the state of Veracruz, the bit that the U.S. invaded. And he had some back and forth with the Mexican government about getting permission to work, and eventually he did get permission, but then it was revoked. He says that the Mexican government decided you had to be a Mexican national to practice medicine and be hired by this company. That's something I was not aware of, and something I've got to look into. But he ended up then going into private practice. He said he was going to go into private practice, and I expect that it was successful because he does seem to have stayed on in Mexico until he died. And his obituary shows that he died in Mexico, and he was survived by his wife and daughter, who were both in Halifax, and he died in August 1941. Now, his first donation to the museum appears to have been made in 1921. Bear in mind the museum was in Marshall College. And he wrote to Professor Reed, who was running the museum at that stage, and said, I had the pleasure of seeing you at Marshall College, and I donated some ancient Mexican skulls and other antiquities to the Archaeological Museum under your care. And then he goes on to say, you know, would you like some more? If there's room, I can try and get you some more. And he says, I have a very fine collection of antiquities, and he sent some photographs of the objects. And then he said, you'll observe from these photographs enclosed, I still have a number of skulls on hand. Bear in mind, he's talking to an anatomist. So I've got a number of skulls on hand and a very large number of bones, mostly human, which show evidence of having been used as tools, etc. I also have 2 skulls from Peru, one of which is much elongated due to pressure applied in infancy, and the other appears to have been trephinated, cut in 2 places. It's surgery, brain surgery, that the Incans practice, that the pre-Columbians in Peru practice. And he didn't send, so that was a 1925 letter, no, sorry, 1928 letter. And he didn't send the material for a while, and then in 1930 he got back in touch again, saying he was packing up some cases with some Mexican antiquities and some stuff from the United States as well. I hope that they will reach you in due time and that they may be worthy of a place in your collection and also be of some scientific interest and educational value. And it's interesting there, he's showing he very much knows what the function of the museum was at that point, which was largely educational as well as scientific. And then he goes on to talk about personal things, the difficulty of finding a job, and the situation he was in. Now, before he returned to Mexico to take up the post in 1930 with El Águila, he came back to Aberdeen. And that's where we have this picture from. So he came back to Aberdeen with objects and to visit his collection. And here we see him amongst the materials he purchased or excavated, and they're arranged on this white paper in a very purposeful way, and he's holding that skull casually, staring directly at the camera. He's a man of science and a trophy hunter with his trophies both. The objects have some of their labels clearly visible, and this is only, I mean, the frame is pretty full, but what we see is only a part of what he ended up donating. So in a way, there's a sense of the abundance of the collection. But it does show us a good range of the type of material he donated to the collection, with the human remains, the pots, the dishes, the statues, the axe head, and the figurines. And some of these objects, like that one, is in our exhibition. Although the bulk of what he gave is Mexican, he does seem like someone who almost had a compulsive shopping habit, because he would, when he wrote to Reed, he'd say, I couldn't resist, I was up to my old habits again, I succumbed. All these words to make it sound like he didn't have any control over his acquisition of these objects. And so he sent along things that he'd found from other parts of the world, that he saw in shops in London that he thought were interesting. So, for instance, he says when he was in London, during this trip, when he came back to the UK on his way to moving back to Mexico, he said, I'm leaving early tomorrow morning for Southampton to board a steamer for Mexico. This will be positively my last offense for some time to come. But today I ran across a few very nice articles from Australia and the Pacific Islands. I thought perhaps you would like them. Maybe the fact that he's giving them away makes the offense less offensive. And while he was in Mexico, he continued to shop for archaeological objects. He wrote again to Reed saying, when in Mexico City, I relapsed into my old habits and went round hunting antiquities in my spare time, and I found some splendid pieces which I secured and have left there in storage with a friend. And then goes on to talk about getting them out of Mexico and how easy it would be if you had the money to make an absolutely fantastic collection. And one of the things that comes through in this letter, he talks about having to wait to do more purchasing because he had, as he says, like many people, lost financial position in the 1929 stock market crash. And so we get a sense of someone who is making these collections and donating these objects to the museum at actual personal cost and literal personal cost. It's costing him money, and he's not someone who has a great deal of money, which also raises more questions about why he was doing this, what it meant to him. But clearly it meant a lot because it was going on for years. Now, although he seems to be someone who basically bought the material he donated to the collection, he did make at least one expedition himself, which he wrote about to Reed in great detail. And the opportunity came up because one of the father of one of the employees in the oil camp he knew of some caves that had ancient objects in them. And he says, it seems that the caves contain many walled-up compartments that have not been opened up since they were closed, probably as burying places by the early inhabitants there. And they were also protected because they're more or less filled with what's probably carbon dioxide gas. The lights won't burn in any of these caves when newly broken into. And any individual who has attempted to enter them has had to hurry out as breathing became affected and difficult at once. So he wants to make a trip to these caves, and he planned on taking gas masks to help make breathing all right. And then he wrote back to Reed to talk about the time in the cave and a lengthy description of the setting, and also these images from what he calls their cavalcade as they set out to this site. And you do get a sense of him, there he is, having fun at, for once, being the guy who gets to get on the horse and get in the caves and crawl around and wear the gas mask and find the stuff in situ rather than buying it in the shops in London or in Mexico City. And in these letters to Reed, we see how important being a donor was to him. And as I mentioned, it's interesting considering his financial situation. But for donors to the museum, there were potentially significant social benefits. For instance, Sir William McGregor, who donated material to the museum from his time in Africa, North America, and Australia, and was a colonial governor amongst his many roles, was recognized by having a solo collection of his catalog put together and published in 1912. So there was potential status and position in the community thanks to these donations. I also think that McPherson was trying to maintain a connection with Aberdeen. I think this was part of his sense of the place that had educated him, the place that where he had been born and grown up, and to which he rarely returned. But knowing that he had these objects in the collection and knowing he'd made a contribution to the museum was part of maintaining that tie with his home. And certainly, I don't have the letters from Reed to McPherson, sadly, but I expect that there was pleasure in getting letters from someone who understood the compulsion, who wanted to buy the objects too, who got the succumbing again idea. Now, I mentioned that we have documents associated with the collection. I'll just show you a few examples. He sent sent Reed these photographs of his collection, and part of what's interesting is you get a sense of his idea of his private collection in his museum and how he arranged it and saw the objects. And one of the things I've been trying to do as well is to reunite objects with the documents that we have on them, trying to match them up as best I can. But these are all his photos that he sent to Reed. And also he sent labels and descriptions and explanations, and these can be matched up with the documents again, with the objects again, and they give us more of a sense of him as someone who's trying to be a scholar, someone who's trying to understand the collection that he's acquiring and pass on that knowledge to Reed. Again, more of the photos he sent. You see, he's got the white cloth out, he's trying to isolate the objects. The way in which there's a museum sensibility in these displays I find really interesting. And that sense of being with like-minded people comes through not just in terms of his relationship with Reed, but with a few people he mentioned in Mexico. And this one, Jacinto Tirado, was the man who took them on the trip to the caves that he was so excited about. And this is some of Tirado's personal collection, and these are children who just want to be in a picture, I suspect. Now, his letters to Reed slowed down at the beginning of 1932. when he was invited to represent the University of Aberdeen at the centennial of the National University in Mexico City's medical school, he wrote to the university registrar about that, and then he included a postscript saying, if you should see Emeritus Professor Reed, please give him my regards and tell him I have acquired some magnificent specimens since I returned to Mexico and hope to get them to Aberdeen sometime in the future if occasion should permit. And I think that quotation really should be his epitaph, because that's what he was always saying to Reed and trying to do. Now, I hope as this discussion makes clear, the collection of the University of Aberdeen opens up a route into new histories, allowing us to dig up social relationships and put networks together, show these networks tying people and places together through objects, specifically linking the University of Aberdeen and the region to Latin America. Through these objects, we can find forgotten or untold stories. In the case of McPherson and the Mexican material he donated to the University Museum collection, that social relationship seemed particularly important. He donated materials to Reed to maintain that connection to Aberdeen, to strengthen his relationship with a former teacher, perhaps someone who really mattered in his life, possibly, and to promote himself as a museum patron and benefactor. He remained in Mexico most of his adult life, despite personal financial pressures, the Mexican Revolution, employment uncertainty, separation from a wife, restriction on foreign employees, and health issues. Perhaps his donation to the museum and correspondence with Reed show us how he wanted to be seen amid the uncertainties of his own life. These histories also remind us that a thing's origin is but one aspect of its story, and its story has become part of McPherson's story, Trail's story, and the story of the University of Aberdeen, the story of the region, and the story of the Scottish diaspora. Yet these objects are part of the diaspora too. As immigrants, exiles, and kidnapped victims, these objects have migrated, and their story cannot be contained simply in their place of origin. Their story is part of a history of networks, changing meanings, and movements, and a story of Aberdonians in the Americas. Thank you.